there's been an unhealthy tendency in decades past to see leadership as someone who's impervious, somebody who's impenetrable, who can't be softened, who's just going to go no matter what. And I think what we're starting to see is people saying, wait a second, like, I want to know that my leader is a person. I want to know that he or she has values and relationships they care about. What are they going home to? What do they care about? What matters to them at other parts of the day? And seeing leaders as more approachable, which means humanizing.
Overwhelm, reaction mode, and just keeping up are the old way.
You need real, root-level strategies and practical steps to grow your business or ministry without exhaustion and burnout.
Hi there, we're Anna Saucier
And Megan Gephardt,
best friends and business consultants who help faith-filled women create sustainable growth through simple strategy with a people-first approach.
Here at Apostolic Fruit, we hope to offer you clarity, support, accompaniment, and healing,
one tiny step at a time. Hello, and welcome back to the Apostolic Fruit podcast. I'm your host today, Anna Saucier, and I have a very special guest, not only someone who is special to me, but also special because she's our very first guest on the Apostolic Fruit podcast. We have Margaret Schay. Margaret is a wife, mother, and Catholic mindset coach certified through Metanoia Catholic. Her journey of healing through internal family systems deepened her passion for integrating faith and parts work. As executive director of Right to Life of Louisville, she advocates for the dignity of women and the unborn. She loves theology of the body, French food, language and culture, and walking with others toward healing and wholeness. Welcome, Margaret.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
The most important question is, did I say Louisville right?
You can say it so many ways. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Now that I live here, I say Louisville because I was placing myself too much by saying Louisville.
I meant to ask you that before we get started, but
yeah,
I figured I'd give it a shot. Thank you so much for connecting with us here and just for sharing your experience and all that we're going to talk about. It's really a pleasure. So will you start off with sharing a bit of your journey, your story, what brought you where you are right now?
Yeah. So really my journey to healing and integration, I guess if I were to pick a starting point, I would have to say college. I was a junior in college and I was experiencing very acute depression. I don't think I knew it at the time. I just knew I was really sad and upset a lot. And I figured something was off. So by God's grace, I got introduced to a phenomenal Catholic therapist who really helped me a lot. And that really opened my eyes. And I saw this integration between our faith and our psychology and how they can work together. And so that really sparked this lifelong love for psychology and personal development and growth. And then fast forward, I got married, had kids. Motherhood was challenging and tough in so many ways. And I ended up going back, just kind of noticing things that were coming out in my parenting and my marriage that I wasn't really pleased with my mood and stuff. And so I just, always kind of started treating therapy or help in that way as kind of just like you would any other doctor, right? Like something's not working now, let's go and get some help. And so just a very kind of organic approach. And that kind of gradually led me into coaching eventually. But then I also, in the midst of all of this, my husband and I have had 4 miscarriages in a row. And so parenting is hard enough. Marriage is quite a piece of work. We had our own business, all the different things we're doing. And then you add loss and late-term loss and 4 in a row. So I just have again and again just returned. And every time I've returned to some type of help, I've been blown away by something that's helped me. And so most recently, I really became familiar with internal family systems. And for somebody who's been in and out of therapy for 16 years, that was just the most amazing experience for me. I've seen so many different types. I've tried so many different things. But I found that finally with internal family systems, or parts work as we call it, I was able to really connect with parts of me that I knew were there, but I had never connected with. I had really just analyzed them. I'd observed them. And so that's kind of what brought me here today. I mean, that's a summary, but it's just that constant desire to grow and heal and meet life's challenges I certainly wouldn't have chosen if they were up to me.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you for sharing your story. And again, I see you in those losses and in the hard that you've walked through.
Thank you.
I have a baseline knowledge of parts work and internal family systems, and it has really resonated with me as well. And I get excited about the connections between parts work and holding space for the nuance of all of the different voices internally has a lot to do with people first approach to business and recognizing that it's not just, okay, here's what we're doing and here's where we're going, and you people go out and just do it. A people first approach recognizes that we have all these different voices and all these different gifts. And what would happen if we listen to those and if we take the time and space to do that? I think that will come into our conversation today and what we'd like to focus on. Because in one of our last conversations, actually, you and I have connected several times, and I want to tell you that you've been sort of it feels like a sounding board for me as we've developed Apostolic Fruit and its focus, and I'm so grateful for that. So I want to thank you for that. And after the last conversation that we had, you sent a follow-up email and you said, and I'll quote it, "I keep thinking of the line you use, 'We are human first.' And I think that is so crucial. Because what is the point of all of this work if I lose my humanity in the process?" And that really was like a chills and mic drop moment for me, because that's just it, isn't it? It's not that it's a great thing to be people first as a sort of ideology, like this is
Right.
what makes us stand out, but that it really, really matters, because we can so easily have great intentions and to say this is how we want to do it, and we have a great mission and we have a great purpose, but it's a slippery slope when we're not really intentional about what we're doing and how we're doing it. So that's what I would like to talk about it today. And where are these places that we see in business and in ministry, in nonprofits, where we do all this work, but we actually start to lose our humanity and it starts to kind of slip away. So I want to invite you to say, where have you seen this? Where does that slippery slope begin or settle in losing humanity in the process?
Well, the first example that comes to mind is a situation I was very, very close to. And it was a situation where I was working in a nonprofit and they had a beautiful mission, loved the mission, was very on board with it, many beautiful people. But some of the people kind of at the helm would routinely mow over other people. So it would be like, well, because we're pursuing this mission and there's no room for error, they had a very strong perfectionist part and very strong control parts that would come out in a very unhealthy way where they would kind of overreact to things. And it was this terrifying and fascinating experience to me because I was watching this and I was kind of, in terms of like the people on the team that I was on, I was one of the relatively newer people. And so I hadn't been used to the dynamic that was playing out, but apparently the people on this team had been very used to it. And I guess this is just how this goes. This is what this person does. And then this is everybody's role and we all fall into our places and blah, blah, blah. And so I'm watching this and, I've had therapy and different things. And I was watching it and I thought, oh my goodness, like this is not good. This is really not good. And I was pretty quickly gaslit. I was pretty quickly told it's okay. Let's figure this out or, just everything was excused. That was what I just noticed. And people would acknowledge that the problem was a problem, that it was serious, but then they would make paths around it. So it would be like, okay, this is a problem, but now we're going to accommodate in this way. Okay, so this person misbehaves this way. If we put this other person in the room, they won't misbehave that way. And I was like, well, what about just putting a boundary and saying, look, if you behave that way, you don't come. Like, we're adults. Like, we shouldn't be putting up special parameters for this situation. And I had meetings with upper leadership and I said, why don't we remove this situation? We can change this. It was very, very unhealthy. And their response was, well, we've discussed that, but they're so tied to the mission, we're afraid we'll lose our mission if we make them leave. And I was like, all right, I'm out. Okay. Because ultimately, what we see when people put the mission above the people, we see that the mission actually becomes appeasing the difficult people, appeasing the parts of others that tend to bully or mow over or manipulate or lose their cool, right? And we can all have these parts. I certainly had many conversations where I said, look, I'm not asking for perfection, but we do have to have standards of professionalism and charity and kindness. And we can't attempt to intimidate or bully. I mean, it sounds kind of crazy and obvious, but I found out that I wasn't the only person who's had that experience in a mission-driven place. That through sharing that people have said, yeah, no, like that happens, unfortunately, where it's like, well, this person's super devoted to the mission. And I was like, well, are they really devoted to the mission or are they devoted to getting their way? Let's make that distinction. Are they devoted to the mission or getting their way? And are we devoted to the mission or appeasing them so that we don't have to deal with their temper tantrum? So that's definitely the first very dramatic. I literally did choose to quit that position because it was so unhealthy. It was a very unhealthy dynamic there.
Yeah. Yeah. That is quite a strong example. But I love the strength of the example, because then we can also bring it back and say, okay, where do these seeds of appeasement can begin also? Because appeasing these people or these behaviors, we also can start to tend to do that within ourselves. Like, I'm appeasing yes, I'm overworked and underpaid, but the mission, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you would see that a lot. Yeah.
This is what you've signed up for. Kind of, okay, we signed up to serve, and so we have to give everything. It's almost like a martyrdom pressure that can be placed through these kind of very mission-driven or ministry-driven situations.
Yeah, for sure.
One other thing this makes me think of, Margaret, and I wonder your thoughts on this as well, because in Apostolic Fruit, we're tying people first to operations and strategy. And I've observed something interesting in sometimes I would go to a nonprofit website and see the celebration of super low operational costs, which, as we know, includes what people are paid.
Right.
The people working inside the mission. And so I see this as kind of an obvious example of we're celebrating that we're not paying our people very much. Everything's going out to the mission. Everything's going out to the programs. And it's just sort of an obvious way that I see this play out.
That is a fascinating point. I was just in a meeting recently about, I run a nonprofit. And so like, what are the percentages and how does that work? And a conversation about that. And I do think it is so important to compensate people well. Everybody has to be compensated well. And certainly there are tiers and corporate positions and certain things are obviously going to bring in different levels. There's pay scale for sure. But I think you're really hitting on a point, and that is that we tend to excuse poor employee treatment as a reason to pursue a mission. And we have to look at that whole person. So gone are the days of just seeing what you can produce. And now we want to see who you are. What are those needs? And in an economy that's changing and very demanding, what does that mean? Well, we need to pay our employees more, all right? We need to pay them more because costs have gone up. So we have to meet that. And that's what is respectful of human dignity, right? If we're going to say that we want to serve people in whatever the field is, whether it's the pro-life movement, working with those without homes or anyone in it, whatever the need is, if we're going to be people first, we have to be making sure that those directly under our care as leaders in businesses are compensated fairly. And that's financially, but that's also just having reasonable expectations too. I think that's so important. We have this corporate approach in the nonprofit world. And I wouldn't even say that the corporate approach is good for the corporate worker, right? I would say the corporate approach just needs to go. We just all need to be human. We need to stop this distinction between like, you're a robot, you show up, you produce, corporate, right? Wall Street. I'm like, listen, we're not all working on Wall Street, and Wall Street really isn't that healthy to work at anyway. So,
did anybody ever think so?
Right, exactly. So let's stop this kind of like, because you can see it even in corporations. I mean, in for-profits, it's like the mission, right? The mission is to make money or the mission is whatever. Okay, well, you still can't mow over people in any space, no matter how much you pay them, no matter if you pay them a very generous salary or a terrible salary, you can't mow over them. And I think sometimes we justify it on both ends. Like for the mission, we pay you less. And because we're paying you so much, we can use you more. So we can see it on both ends.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And those values have to be well defined because you can say, okay, where do you put people? What do you want to choose?
Mhm.
Because in practice, your people are not first right now. Your people are not the highest
Right.
priority. Something else is the highest priority. And all that just starts with awareness. And then, okay, decision time.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you want to do this differently or not? Yeah.
Exactly.
So what's another place you see this in?
I'll see it a lot with you'll have often again managers typically who will be working late and long hours. And this is challenging. I mean, I do a lot of flexible work. Right now I have a sick kid home, right? So I'm answering emails in the car and things like that. So it's something I'm always working on, but I'm trying to set good boundaries with your time. A lot of times I do use the schedule send. So I might work late after the kids are in bed or something or have a moment, but I'll schedule send for working hours. And I don't always do that. I need to be better about that, But I think managers in general, if we just keep better boundaries, I think that that's a really important thing. It's very hard for an employee to not feel some type of pressure because we all lead by example, right? However, I lead, whether it's excellent leadership or poor leadership, is essentially what I expect from other people, right? So, what I expect from myself, by extension, I expect from others. And so, if we're quickly responding and feeding into that, then other people feel that pressure. And there's such a balance there, right? Because on the one hand, there is a part of me, I have an activator part. I just like to, if I have the phone in my hand and I get a message from somebody, let me just respond and now it's off my to-do list. So there's a balance, and I think that balance plays out in the conversations, when somebody has a sick kid, when somebody has a pet to take to the vet, like when somebody has a plumbing issue, right? We're all human, right? So at the end of the day, we all have a pillow and a bed to fall on. We all have a shower that may or may not leak, a dishwasher that might stop, whatever. We have to be there to let the electrician in. When those opportunities come up, when an employee or a co-manager or whatever has an issue, how do we receive that? I think that's kind of where it hits the most. It's like, is that response like, okay, yeah, of course. I mean, yeah, we've all got a home. We've all got to be there. Or is it like, is it just really calculating? Is there a lot of pause? Are there, maybe this is another point, the arbitrary rules. I remember working at a different place and real stickler on the rules to the point where it was like, well, this doesn't actually make any logical sense now. So we can dehumanize so much of our interactions in an attempt to make everything equal and a fair playing field. And the reality is that it's not. And we have to accept that there is going to be a different demand on an employee who's taking care of their elderly parents than there is on an employee who's single than there is on an employee who has children. And that's not to say that if you're single, you don't have responsibilities, because sometimes I think poor single people get thrown under the bus. We all have a life to live and we all have different responsibilities. And there does need to be a certain acceptance of stuff going wrong and variations being needed. And maybe sometimes somebody needs longer bereavement time. We figure that out. I know we can't just be like, whatever, but I do think there's just a lot more space for a more human approach.
Absolutely. I just nodding, if you're listening, I've just been nodding frantically along to everything Margaret was saying. And one thing that I think you really hit the nail on is the importance is in the conversations and the connections in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Because we are not assembly line factories. We are humans. And so it isn't just input, output. There is so much nuance and so much life that goes on. And we all have the ability to say, I'll just speak as a leader for a second, to say, hey guys, I worked all day Saturday on this. I was in a flow and I do not expect this of you going forward. And I think these kinds of things need to be said over and over and over again, because like you say, as the leader, I am setting an example as the leader of the team, whether you like it or not. What I do sets an example. And
Right.
if that's different from what I say, then we have to say the other thing too,
Yes.
and keep reminding that. And that helps the team, but it also helps our internal selves to speak out and to pause and say, now, wait a second, that felt good, but it's not something we're going to do all the time. Right. And
Right.
then your parts and your nervous system are like, oh, okay, I get it.
Right. Right.
And it's less likely to start becoming this habit. And then all of a sudden we've lost ourselves.
Mhm.
So much of this is in the pause to have the conversation with yourself, to have the conversation with other people, to understand, to just talk through. And I had a great conversation with Heather Kim a few weeks ago, and she used the phrase to speak the unspoken.
Yes.
Right? It's so important to speak the unspoken. Or Megan and I talk a lot about speaking the meta, like the meta of what's going on here. And a big part of this is that between a leader and a leadee, somebody on your team, there is inherently a power differential. So we
Mhm.
have to
Yeah.
recognize as a leader, it is our responsibility to minimize that, to bring the conversation back together, because otherwise, when you ask something that might be out of scope or it is starting to push, it's hard for someone to speak up and say, well, this is against our values or this is against our principles. When we create the environment of speaking the unspoken and talking through these things, that in itself is a much more people first approach.
Yes, I think that's such a good point, especially the point about leading the way as the leader, because there has to be a top person, right? You have to have an organizational structure for sure. But I think you're right. It's so important that that leader has that sense of like, okay, there is a power difference here, and this is necessary for the structure and function of the organization and everything. But to just be very careful when I've been an employee and in that particular difficult situation I mentioned earlier, that's very difficult. And I'm a pretty outspoken person. And I am very like, hey, this is a problem. But I mean, I really had to temper that. And so I just think when an employee is bringing up a problem and they're consistently bringing up a problem, there needs to be just so much kind of, I think, willingness to listen and to hear, because that takes a lot of courage, even in somebody who's very outspoken. And when somebody says, I can't do this, I mean, that's pretty telling. So we really have to give that space and realize that that's very vulnerable. That's a very vulnerable place to be in for an employee to speak up about something. And so giving that space where it's safe to speak up and it's safe to disagree is so important.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And two, we can recognize that it's vulnerable for the leader as well. To I don't know what's going to come out of this person's mouth. I've got a mission to run. I've got so on both sides, and that's the power of being able to speak that out for the leader to say, okay, I feel kind of uncomfortable. I'm not great at this. I deeply want to listen to you. I want to make a connection. I want to help support you in your role. And just to speak, like, this is uncomfortable for both of us. Like, how powerful is the vulnerability there, right? And how much it
Yes. Yeah.
consolidates that power differential when you just say it.
Hmm.
I think this could be beautifully connective moments.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's been an unhealthy tendency in decades past to see leadership as someone who's impervious, somebody who's impenetrable, who can't be softened, who's just going to go no matter what. And I think what we're starting to see is people saying, wait a second, like, I want to know that my leader is a person. I want to know that he or she has values and relationships they care about. What are they going home to? What do they care about? What matters to them at other parts of the day? And seeing leaders as more approachable, which means humanizing them. So we humanize ourselves and experience that and then set that tone and present a more humanized version to be able to say, I have a sick kid, I can't come in today. Okay. There was another place I worked where it was like, oh, that took a lot of courage to say, right? And so it's like, okay, we need to have a better environment around that where people feel totally free to say, I have a sick kid, I have to be home. Like that shouldn't be
Yeah.
a bad thing. Yeah.
Yeah. One of my most meaningful examples of workspace was I was early 20s and I was working at a commercial real estate finance company in Anchorage, Alaska. And it was my first winter in Alaska, which is brutal. And I woke up one morning and I literally was like, I can't get out of bed. I can't do anything. I have zero motivation. And most everybody knows in winter in Alaska, you see light for like 3 hours in the middle of the day and it's dusk and you can get can affect you greatly. And so I just found myself frozen, and I get a call from my boss. I think it was like 10:30 and he's like, hey, you coming in today? And I said, JJ, I'm sorry. I can't do anything. Like, I don't know what's going on. I can't get out of bed. And he said, oh, okay, I know what's going on. And here's what you're going to do. Let's make a plan. And he said, you're not going to come in today. You're just going to get up. You're going to go to the gym. You're going to have a good lunch. You're going to take it slow and you're going to rest. And something so simple. And it wasn't like, okay, you're going to need to take a sick day or immediately the policies come through. It was immediately, let's make sure that you're taken care of. And that has set with me for 20 years. It's a meaningful experience.
That's awesome. That is so beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Margaret, our time has flown by. I'll put you on the spot a little bit. What is one practical step forward, leader to leader, that you would leave with our listeners if something has jumped out at them? And these can be difficult things to change. And so what would be one small step?
I think it would just be that awareness. You can't change it all. And you might see things you do that you're like, ooh, I shouldn't do that. In this conversation, things came to my mind where I'm like, oh yeah, I need to be better at that. I was answering emails in the process of being in something else. I'm like, you know what? I could have just been there was a long train going by and I was answering all these emails. And I thought, okay, I could just be here and just be aware, So if we can just kind of notice what we're doing, I'm not even saying change it. Like, don't make a plan to change. Just be like, oh, do I send an email every time I'm at a long stoplight or a train goes by, or I'm at the doctor's office with my kids, or there's a big grocery cart with the person in front of me at the store? Just notice where do I jump into action? I think leaders do tend to be very action oriented, right? And so we have a difficult time pausing. And that's not to say that we have to pause before every single response, right? We can get a text or an email and respond promptly right there in the moment when we have it in front of us. But just notice. I think notice in your day where you jump in. I mean, is there any moment in your day where you are just doing nothing? Do you ever sit at a long train and do nothing? Do you let the train go by and watch the train? Or do you have to check your texts and phone? So I know that's probably pretty common advice. I mean, I know we're always talking about slowing down in this work, but that would be where I would begin, just to notice.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, awareness. I notice is such a powerful phrase, and I love it. Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you for being here, for the work that you do and your leadership role.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure this has been.
We hope you loved today's episode. If so, would you take a moment to share it with a friend?
If you haven't already, come connect with us human to human at apostolicfruit.com/connect. When you're ready, we'd love to support you more deeply.
May the Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you,
and turn his face toward you and give you peace.